A lot of towns didn't even bother with a sheriff. If trouble came, it was neighbors banding together, forming vigilante groups with shotguns and rope. Folks didn't wait for the law. They were the law. And if you crossed the wrong crowd, you might find yourself strung up before sunrise. Stagecoaches rattled along dusty trails, but they were easy prey. Masked men with shotguns stopped them in broad daylight, ordering passengers out with a bark. Drivers raised their hands, strongboxes were cracked open, and passengers were frisked for coin or jewelry. It was quick, brutal, and everyone knew the rules. Hand it over or get shot. Hollywood makes gunfights look long and fancy, but truth is, most were over in seconds. A twitch, a flash, and it was done. Half the time, bullets hit innocent bystanders instead of the target. Saloon shootouts didn't just drop one man. They could scatter a whole crowd in screams and blood before the smoke cleared. Stealing cattle wasn't just theft. It was a death sentence, whether legal or not. Angry ranchers saw it as stealing their livelihood, and more than a few rustlers ended up dangling from a tree with a sign pinned to their shirt. Out on the range, "Don't steal another man's herd," was enforced with rope, not mercy. Some outlaws weren't feared so much as admired. Local folks sometimes hid them in barns, slipped them food, or tipped them off when the law came sniffing around. To struggling families, a bandit robbing a bank or a railroad didn't seem like the worst thing in the world. Sometimes the outlaw looked more like a hero. Saloons weren't just bars. They were the beating heart of frontier towns. You might cash a check, send a letter, strike a mining deal, or sit through an impromptu trial, all in the same smoky room. Every kind of character passed through those swinging doors, and whether for whiskey or business, everyone ended up there sooner or later. Even water could kill you. Frontier towns drank straight from rivers, wells, or barrels hauled in by wagon, and plenty of it carried cholera or dysentery. Whole families would be down in days. No filters, no treatment. Just a dip of the ladle and a prayer you wouldn't be doubled over by sundown. Guns fired for joy as much as for anger. At parties or holidays, men shot into the air to celebrate. Problem was, those bullets didn't vanish. They came down blocks away, sometimes through a roof or into an unlucky bystander. Folks learned quick to duck for cover when they heard shooting after a few drinks. Ranchers fought what were called range wars, torching barns, shooting cattle, and stringing up rivals. Fences were cut, herds scattered, and gunmen hired to settle disputes over grass and grazing rights. Land meant life, and if your neighbor fenced off water or grass, sometimes the only way to win was with fire and blood. Settlers and native tribes clashed in raids that left scars on both sides. Cabins were burned, livestock stolen, families killed. Tribes struck back against encroachment on their land, and settlers responded with brutal reprisals. It wasn't one-sided heroics or villains. It was a cycle of violence, and everyone along the frontier lived with that fear. Mail carriers weren't just hauling letters, they were gambling with their lives. Ambushes were common on lonely stretches between towns. Bandits wanted the payroll, and tribes sometimes saw them as intruders. Every run was a risk, and riders carried guns close at hand, knowing the bag over their saddle might get them killed. Bank robbers weren't above dragging innocent folks along as hostages. Sometimes they'd march townspeople in front of them as shields, daring a sheriff to take the shot. Ordinary men and women were caught in the middle, forced to walk at gunpoint through their own streets to buy an outlaw a few more minutes of escape. Railroad work chewed men up. Dynamite blasts went off too early, or rock slides buried crews alive. Rails had to be laid through mountains, deserts, and swamps, and death was just part of the job. When the trains finally ran, folks cheered, but plenty of nameless workers never lived to see it. Drought didn't just mean thirst, it meant ruin. Crops withered, cattle dropped dead, and families packed what little they had and left. Some walked away from land they'd fought tooth and nail to settle. On the plains, when the sky refused to rain, dreams dried up just as fast as the fields. Knife fights in saloons were as common as gunfights. A broken bottle, a kitchen blade, or a Bowie knife could settle an insult as fast as a bullet. The fights were messy and bloody, and they didn't make legends in dime novels. But for the poor soul caught in one, they were just as final. Buffalo weren't just majestic, they were dangerous. Stampedes could flatten wagons, riders, and fences in moments. Thousands of hooves thundered like an earthquake, and if you were caught in the middle, there was no escape. Entire camps were wiped out under the rush of animals bigger than horses and moving like a river of muscle. Many boomtowns didn't want constant gunfire, so they had check your guns rules. Dodge City and Tombstone made visitors hand over their weapons before stepping into town. It wasn't the free-for-all Hollywood shows. Plenty of places wanted peace, and sheriffs knew fewer pistols in town meant fewer dead men on Saturday night. Rattlesnakes were everywhere, and bites were common. Trouble was, the so-called cures often did more harm than good. Folks tried burning the wound with gunpowder, cutting it open with a knife, or pouring whiskey down the victim. More often than not, the snake bite killed you, or the treatment did. Either way, you were in trouble. Horse thieves were hated, and mobs often hanged them. But under the law, stealing a horse wasn't technically a hanging crime. Frontier justice didn't care much for fine print, though. By the late 1880s, Arizona and New Mexico even went so far as to make train robbery a capital offense instead. Guns weren't always the weapon of choice. A whiskey bottle, an axe handle, or just a pair of fists could end a fight. Violence was part of life, and if a gun wasn't handy, folks used whatever they had. Plenty of men limped out of a saloon bleeding without a single shot ever fired. Prairie fires were nightmares. Flames moved faster than horses, stretching for miles in a wall of smoke and heat. Families fled with whatever they could grab, watching everything behind them turn to ash. There was no fighting it, no stopping it, just a desperate race to get out of the fire's path. Gambling wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of life in frontier towns. Saloons ran card games around the clock, with poker and faro being the favorites. Faro tables especially packed boomtown bars until reformers cracked down in the 1890s. The games weren't always clean. Rigged decks and slick dealers were common, and plenty of rounds ended with somebody drawing iron. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare luxuries, and plenty of folks went years without tasting either. Out on the frontier, scurvy wasn't something from sailors' tales. It was real. Bleeding gums, swollen joints, and teeth falling out were common signs. Most families lived off salt pork, beans, and bread, and if you wanted greens, you'd better grow them yourself. The endless prairie winds never let up. They rattled shacks, tore roofs from barns, and toppled outhouses like toys. A single spark carried on that wind could spread into a fire-swallowing whole towns in minutes. Folks nailed boards across doors just to keep them shut, and still, you'd wake up some mornings with dirt piled in your bed. Train robbers didn't just wave guns. They sometimes pulled up tracks and waited for the engine to smash itself into the dirt. A locomotive wrecked at full speed meant chaos, dead passengers, and easy loot. It was as ruthless as it was effective, and by the time lawmen showed up, the gang and the gold were already gone. Wells were the lifeblood of settlements, but when they ran dry, it left families and travelers stranded with nothing but dust. On the plains, there might not be another water source for miles, and people died of thirst just yards from where they'd hoped to settle. Horses collapsed, wagons baked, and what looked like home turned into death. Whiskey was the cure-all of the frontier, but much of it was poison. To stretch supply, bartenders cut it with kerosene, turpentine, or tobacco juice. One glass might numb you, another could blind or kill you. Folks joked about coffin varnish and rot gut. But when a man needed a drink, he usually took the risk and swallowed anyway. Boomtowns lived and died with the mines. When the gold or silver played out, people packed up overnight. Streets that once roared with noise turned into empty shells with swinging doors creaking in the wind. Entire towns were left behind like ghosts. Shacks, saloons, and dreams rotting in the sun while fortune-seekers rushed off to the next strike. Outlaws didn't always hit just one mark. The Dalton gang once tried robbing 2 Coffeyville banks in broad daylight on the same day. They marched in with guns ready, but armed townspeople poured out with rifles and shot them down in the street. It was supposed to be a legendary score. Instead, it became their bloody grave. Justice wasn't careful on the frontier. Pussies sometimes hanged the wrong man entirely, dragged from a cell, strung up on rumor or bad witness. A stranger passing through town could find himself accused just for looking the part. By the time doubts arose, the man was swinging, and lawmen shrugged. On the frontier, mistakes were often permanent. A mining claim wasn't just a piece of dirt, it was a man's future. Disputes over who staked first often escalated to gunfire, and prospectors killed each other in the hills. Judges couldn't keep up. Sheriffs looked the other way. And sometimes the jury was whoever stood fastest with a pistol. Gold fever turned neighbors into killers. Cattle drives were brutal, and men died by the dozens. A slip during a river crossing meant drowning under the herd. A stampede could trample cowboys before they had time to move. Nights in the saddle stretched on without sleep, and one wrong step by a horse left a man crushed in the mud, forgotten on the trail. Out west, water was worth killing over. Neighbors shot each other dead over who had the right to a spring or whose ditch got priority when rains ran thin. Court cases dragged on for years, but bullets settled most disputes faster. In a land where a bucket could mean survival, freight wagons weren't always safe just because they'd made it to town. Bandits hijacked loads right in broad daylight, snatching supplies off wagons in the middle of Main Street. Flour, tools, ammunition, all stolen before anyone could react. Sometimes whole shipments vanished this way, and settlers went hungry, because thieves knew even towns couldn't always fight back. Traveling alone between frontier towns was practically asking to get robbed. Highwaymen lurked along trails, and plenty of lone riders simply vanished. If the bandits didn't get you, thirst or rattlesnakes might. That's why smart folks joined wagon trains or stuck together in groups. Out west, there was safety in numbers, but alone, you were fair game. Frontier jails were little more than shacks with bars. Prisoners broke out constantly, sawing through wood or walking off when guards fell asleep. Some towns couldn't even afford locks, and cells were just chained ankles. It wasn't unusual for a lawman to haul in the same outlaw 3 times in a week, each escape easier than the last. Some gunmen picked fights just to make a name for themselves. A reputation meant fear, and fear kept men alive. They'd call out strangers in saloons, slap someone in the street, or insult a local just to provoke a draw. Most weren't quick-draw duels. They were ambushes or drunken brawls. Still, enough men died to cement a legend. Smallpox swept through frontier towns like wildfire, leaving death and scars behind. An outbreak could wipe out half a community in weeks. Survivors carried the marks for life, pitted faces, blindness, and weakness that never faded. Towns quarantined too late, doctors were helpless, and travelers carried it unknowingly from camp to camp. The disease struck fast and showed no mercy. For women in frontier camps, life was constant danger. Assault was common, and justice was rare. Courts seldom punished attackers, and many cases never even reached a hearing. Women traveling alone faced even more risk, with predators hiding behind every offer of help. Survival meant trusting carefully, carrying a weapon, and hoping the men nearby were honest. Lynch mobs didn't always wait for proof. Men were dragged from jails and strung up without trial, sometimes just for being unpopular or owing the wrong debt. Personal grudges became death sentences, and townsfolk often looked the other way. The rope wasn't always about justice. It was about revenge, and plenty of innocent men swung for nothing. Rivers were as deadly as deserts. Cattle drives often meant fording strong currents, and men got swept away alongside the herd. Horses stumbled, wagons flipped, and swollen rivers dragged everything under. Cowboys were buried in sandbars far downstream. One slip on wet stone could mean drowning before help ever arrived, with the river carrying away the body. Outlaw hideouts weren't just shacks. They were built like forts. Remote canyons and dugouts were reinforced with thick logs, escape tunnels, and armed lookouts. Posses that tried to storm them often found themselves in gunfights lasting days. These hideouts gave gangs safe places to split loot, heal wounds, and plan the next raid, often under lawmen's noses. Gambling debts weren't settled with lawyers, they were settled with guns. If a man lost more than he could pay, he might find himself staring down a pistol behind the saloon. Some never walked out alive. Winning meant money, losing could mean your life. In the West, playing cards wasn't just a game. It was a gamble in every sense. Drinking contests weren't harmless fun. Men lined up whiskey glasses until one collapsed, and sometimes the loser didn't get back up at all. Alcohol poisoning killed plenty of cowboys, but the culture of proving toughness kept the contests alive. Passing out under the table was common. Dying by morning wasn't unusual. Train robbers didn't just threaten passengers. They blew up bridges and trestles to stop trains altogether. A collapsed crossing meant derailed engines, wrecked cars, and terrified travelers easy to strip of valuables. Repair crews worked for weeks, and sometimes whole lines shut down. Outlaws didn't care about collateral damage. The wreck itself was part of the plan. Most frontier towns couldn't afford fire brigades, so they set wooden water barrels on corners and prayed. When flames broke out, everyone grabbed buckets and formed a line. It worked sometimes, but often a single spark devoured half the town overnight. In places built of pine and canvas, fire wasn't just danger. It was destiny waiting. Oxen were the engines of the frontier, but they dropped on the trail as fast as men did. Families stranded beside their broken wagons watched dreams rot in the dust. Without oxen, there was no moving forward, and folks sometimes buried their hopes along with the animals, left staring at an endless horizon they couldn't cross. Bandits didn't just snatch purses, they searched passengers head to toe, stripping away jewelry hidden in boots or money tucked into coats. People thought they were clever, but outlaws knew every trick. When a revolver stared you down, you handed it all over. Stage rides weren't adventures. They were lessons in how quickly dignity could vanish. Winter was cruel, and wolves and coyotes prowled close to every settlement. They picked off calves, colts, and sometimes half a herd before men could respond. Gunfire echoed in the night, but the packs always came back hungrier. On the plains, livestock meant survival, and every howl in the dark was a promise of loss. Boomtown hotels were often nothing but canvas tents with lice, drafty seams, and leaky roofs. Guests slept on flea-bitten straw mats, listening to drunks stagger outside. Rain turned the floor into mud, and privacy didn't exist. Still, men paid gladly, because even a filthy cot under a tarp was better than freezing on bare ground. Telegraph poles tempted every bored cowboy with a rifle. Insulators made a satisfying plink when hit, and some couldn't resist target practice. Too many shots, though, and whole lines went down, leaving towns cut off for weeks. Messages that might have saved lives or summoned help never arrived, all because some trigger-happy writer wanted to hear glass break. Bartenders weren't just pouring whiskey, they were keeping order. Most kept sawed-off shotguns under the counter for rowdy drunks, and some used them often. When fists flew and bottles shattered, a bartender's glare with one hand resting on that shotgun usually cooled the room fast. In a saloon, the barkeep wasn't just a server. He was sheriff, too. Stagecoach routes became so notorious that some drivers joked holdups were just part of the timetable. A coach might get robbed 2, even 3 times in a single day, sometimes by entirely different gangs. Passengers handed over valuables with weary shrugs, like paying a fare. On certain lines, getting robbed was as regular as the mail. Mining was rich for owners, misery for workers. When miners struck for better pay, owners hired armed thugs to break them. Strikers were beaten in the street, even shot dead at mine gates. Courts looked away, sheriffs pocketed bribes, and the message was clear. In the West, gold spoke louder than blood spilled on gravel. After the buffalo slaughter, settlers gathered bones by the wagon load. They sold them by the ton to be ground into fertilizer or used in sugar refining. Plains once black with herds turned into boneyards, and pioneers made cash off the remains. The bones of the West weren't just buried. They were bought, shipped, and boiled for profit. Card tables in saloons weren't honest. Dealers stacked decks. Gamblers used mirrors, and greenhorns lost every dime before realizing the game was rigged. Sometimes a man called out the cheat, and the only answer was cold steel drawn across the felt. In the frontier West, gambling didn't just empty your pockets, it could empty your life. Coyotes filled the night with howls, a chorus that unsettled cattle and kept families awake. Their calls bounced across valleys like spirits laughing in the dark. Farmers lost chickens and calves, ranchers lost sleep, and more than one child clutched a blanket in fear. Out west, the darkness wasn't quiet. It was alive and always hungry. Stagecoaches were heavy, clumsy beasts, and the rutted trails they followed often flipped them like toys. Passengers were thrown into ditches, bones snapped, and heads split open. Horses bolted, cargo scattered, and sometimes survivors crawled miles for help. Riding a coach wasn't comfortable travel. It was gambling with your body every time the wheels rolled forward. Jail bars didn't always mean safety. Angry mobs stormed cells and dragged prisoners out before trials, sometimes for real crimes, sometimes for whispers. Once outside, the verdict was always the same: rope over a tree limb, a body left swinging in the night. On the frontier, justice wasn't slow. It was merciless, and it rarely waited. Public hangings weren't grim, quiet affairs. They were entertainment. Whole crowds turned out. Families brought lunches, and children sat on shoulders to watch. Men cheered, women gasped, and vendors sometimes sold food nearby. For many frontier towns, justice was as much a show as it was a warning. about what happened if you stepped out of line. Rattlesnakes were an everyday hazard, and more than one man met his end from a wrong step. They slithered into boots left outside and curled into bedrolls for warmth. A bite meant fever, swelling, and death more often than survival. Every cowboy learned quick. Shake your boots in the morning, or you might not make it home. Traveling medicine shows promised miracles in a bottle, cures for pain, baldness, or heartbreak. In truth, the elixirs were poison, alcohol, opium, or kerosene disguised with flavoring. Salesmen stirred crowds with fast talk, took their money, and rode off before sickness set in. Folks desperate for hope kept buying anyway, turning snake oil into a booming trade. Tornadoes gave no warning and no mercy. In minutes, they flattened entire towns, ripping apart churches, schools, and cabins like toys. Survivors crawled from rubble to find neighbors missing and fields strewn with debris for miles. On the open plains, there was no hiding from the sky. Cowboys lived under the open sky, which meant when sudden cold fronts swept across the prairie, some never woke up. A man could fall asleep warm by the fire and freeze stiff by morning. Blankets weren't enough against the biting winds, and more than one hand was found frozen in his saddle. Reins still clutched tight. The winter of 1886 to 87, known as the Big Die-Up, brought snow so deep and cold so bitter that hundreds of thousands of cattle perished. Ranches went bankrupt overnight, and men who thought they were kings of the plains ended up paupers. The sight of frozen herds stretching for miles marked the end of the open range dream forever. Saloons weren't just for whiskey, they doubled as polling places. On election days, men voted with a drink in hand, and arguments quickly turned bloody. Ballot boxes were stuffed, fists flew, and gunshots rang out when tempers spilled over. Democracy out west wasn't clean. It was loud, corrupt, and often decided by whoever walked away breathing. Lightning storms spooked cattle into deadly stampedes. Thousands of pounds of beef thundered through camps, crushing tents, fires, and men. Cowboys dove into brush or scrambled onto rocks to survive. In the dark, hooves shook the earth, and screams were drowned by the herd's roar. Gold dust was money, but crooked officials at weighhouses made sure plenty stuck to their fingers. They shaved off pinches, used faulty scales, or swapped dust for brass filings. Miners who complained often lost more than gold. They lost their lives. In the boomtown economy, fairness wasn't measured by the ounce. It was measured by who carried a gun. Judges on the frontier carried pistols to their own courtrooms. Trials could turn violent when tempers boiled, and more than one gavel pounded with a revolver lying beside it. Justice wasn't blind, it was armed. A judge needed to be ready because out west, a jury's verdict could be followed by a hail of bullets. Whiskey-fueled brawls sometimes swallowed whole streets. Men spilled out of saloons, swinging bottles and fists, until the sheriff called in every deputy to break it up. Windows shattered, wagons overturned, and unlucky bystanders were dragged in, whether they wanted or not. A frontier Saturday night often ended with bruises, broken bones, and a few bodies cooling in the dust. Many graves went unmarked simply because there weren't enough coffins, preachers, or even wood. Men were buried in blankets or left with a pile of stones to keep coyotes away. Travelers came across lonely mounds on every trail, reminders that death was constant, and not everyone got a name carved in wood to remember them by. Frontier doctors tried anything that might work. They poured kerosene into wounds, sprinkled gunpowder to cauterize cuts, or stitched with dirty needles. Infection was common, death even more so. Desperate patients agreed to almost any treatment because doing nothing felt worse. Out west, medicine was often just pain mixed with guesswork, and hope was the strongest drug. Winter wasn't just cold, it was deadly. Blizzards could roll in fast, sealing whole communities in snowdrifts. Livestock froze, woodpiles ran out, and people starved waiting for a thaw. If you didn't stock up enough, you simply didn't make it. For frontier families, winter wasn't cozy. It was a test of whether you lived through spring. Crossing deserts wasn't just hot. It was brutal. By day, the sun baked you raw, lips cracked and tongue swollen. By night, the cold bit so hard you shivered in your boots. Water holes were rare, shade rarer, and the only company was the wind. Out there, you didn't conquer the desert. You survived it, if lucky. Outlaws sometimes sent women ahead as bait. A damsel waved from the roadside calling for help, while her partners waited in the brush. Men who stopped to play hero quickly found themselves staring down pistols. The frontier wasn't chivalry, it was a trap, and even kindness could get you robbed, beaten, or buried by sundown. Rail hubs were magnets for more than trains. Gambling dens, crooked saloons, and organized crime set up shop fast, and prostitution flourished in the shadows. The promise of easy money pulled every sharp dealer into town. For honest travelers, rail hubs weren't just stops. They were jungles, where the law barely kept up with the thieves. Waterholes weren't always salvation. Sometimes an animal stumbled in and died, rotting in the pool. Travelers arrived desperate only to find foul-smelling toxic water that could sicken a whole wagon party. People drank anyway, gambling sickness against thirst. On the frontier, even a drink of water could kill you if luck didn't ride with you. Feuds weren't fought clean. Rivals poisoned or salted each other's wells, leaving families sick or starving. One morning's drink could turn into a death sentence. Out west, water wasn't just precious, it was power. Destroying a well didn't just win a feud. It ended another man's claim to survival, and with it, his stake in the land. Horses gave life out west, but when reins tangled, they could drag riders to death. A boot caught in a stirrup meant being hauled across rocks and sagebrush, bones snapping, while the horse bolted in panic. Cowboys learned to fear the stirrup as much as bullets. Riding was freedom, but every ride carried the risk of death. Labor wars in mines didn't always end with fists. Sometimes dynamite settled arguments. Striking miners tossed charges at company guards, and thugs answered in kind. Explosions echoed through mountain camps, leaving shattered shacks and dead men behind. In mining towns, dynamite was more than a tool, It was a weapon, and both sides knew how to use it. A broken wagon axle wasn't just an inconvenience, it was disaster. Families sat stranded for days, tools worn dull, oxen wasting in their yokes. Every hour meant less water, less food, and less hope. Passing travelers might lend a hand, or they might strip your supplies and ride on. The road didn't forgive weakness. It punished it. Winters hit hard enough that families burned furniture to stay alive. Chairs, bed frames, even tables went into the firebox when wood ran short. Folks sat on crates, wrapped in quilts, staring at bare walls where a dresser used to be. Comfort meant nothing compared to warmth. Epidemics moved faster than the mail. Smallpox, measles, and cholera rolled into towns before warning could spread. Families woke to neighbors coughing blood, doctors powerless, and coffins in short supply. By the time word reached the next settlement, the sickness was already there. The frontier wasn't just rough, it was a place where death traveled first class. Gunpowder was life on the frontier, but it was also a ticking bomb. Stored in sheds or cellars, barrels sometimes overheated and exploded. One spark, one careless lantern, and men were blown apart before they had a chance to run. Gunpowder gave the West its bite, but it also turned barns into graves without warning. Flash floods struck like ambushes. Dry creek beds turned into roaring rivers in minutes, sweeping away homes, barns, and livestock. Whole towns found themselves underwater, their streets turned into raging currents. Survivors clung to rooftops or trees, watching everything else wash downstream. Stagecoach drivers sat in open-air boxes, steering through blizzards and gales. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers, noses, and ears as they clung to reins with numb hands. Passengers shivered under blankets inside, but the driver took the full punishment. Some never thawed out. Frozen stiff on the box, reins locked in their grip like icy chains. Narrow trails meant one wagon could block dozens. Families sometimes sat for days waiting on help, wheels stuck in ruts or wagons bogged down in mud. Food dwindled, tempers flared, and oxen grew weaker with every hour. Progress on the trail wasn't steady. It lurched forward in fits, and a single broken wheel could stall 100 lives. Train robbers didn't always wait for stations. Some climbed aboard between stops, moving car to car, revolvers drawn. Passengers were forced to empty pockets, while the bandits slipped off before anyone could react. By the time the crew discovered the theft, the robbers were gone into the hills. Out west, even mid-journey wasn't safe from outlaws. Doctors were scarce, and surgery usually meant no anesthesia beyond whiskey and someone to hold you down. Tools were crude, infections common, and survival wasn't guaranteed. Amputations were done fast with a saw. If you cried out, nobody thought you weak, because everyone knew it could just as easily be their arm next. Surviving smallpox didn't mean you walked away whole. Scars carved across your face and body stayed for life, and blindness often followed. People feared survivors almost as much as the disease itself. Children grew up disfigured, outcasts in their own towns. Smallpox didn't just kill. It left reminders etched into the skin of those it spared. Rabies outbreaks swept through towns in waves, turning dogs into frothing terrors. Families bolted doors, but some strays slipped through, biting livestock or children before vanishing into alleys. With no cure, the bite was a death sentence. Out west, man's best friend could turn overnight into a nightmare, and a single mad dog spooked whole settlements. Some homesteads went weeks without a single visitor. Families stared at the same four walls, the same endless horizon, and wondered if they'd gone mad. Isolation cut deeper than hunger, with silence broken only by the wind. Folks prayed for travelers just to hear another voice. Out west, loneliness was as deadly as any outlaw. Mail on the frontier was a gamble. Riders faced storms, ambushes, and endless miles of bad country. Letters often vanished, never reaching their outposts. Families waited months for news that never came. Out west, the mail wasn't guaranteed. It was a hope. And sometimes hope was lost to rivers, thieves, or a bullet in the dust. Jailers weren't always noble. Bribes slid across tables, and dangerous men walked free while petty thieves rotted inside. Outlaws bought their way out with gold or favors, and sheriffs looked the other way. Justice on the frontier wasn't blind. It was for sale, and the price was often cheaper than a man's life was worth. Saloons that stayed open all night meant trouble never slept. Fights erupted at midnight, bottles shattered at dawn, and gunshots echoed long after decent folks turned in. The longer the whiskey flowed, the deadlier the room got. A man might walk in sober and hopeful, and by sunrise he'd be drunk, broke, and bleeding in the street. When duels broke out, whole streets emptied in seconds. Folks dove for cover, shutters slammed shut, and bystanders ducked behind barrels. Pistols barked, and one man usually hit the dirt before the echoes faded. The survivors holstered their guns and walked away like nothing happened. In frontier towns, the law often hid with everyone else. Droughts and dust storms turned thriving towns into choking wastelands. Crops shriveled, livestock dropped, and grit coated every surface. Winds blackened the sky, burying fences and cabins in dunes of dirt. Families huddled inside, coughing mud with every breath. Out west, the land itself tested you, and when water vanished, dreams dried up right alongside it. Whiskey-crazed cowboys sometimes rode horses straight into buildings for laughs. They barreled into saloons or general stores, scattering patrons and smashing shelves. Owners cursed, patrons scrambled, and more than one horse slipped and broke a leg inside. Out west, a cowboy's prank wasn't harmless fun. It was reckless chaos that left everyone cleaning up broken glass. Plenty of people simply vanished between towns. A rider left one settlement and never reached the next. No tracks, no body, no explanation. Just gone. Outlaws, weather, thirst, or worse, swallowed them whole. Families waited for years, clinging to hope. But the frontier kept its secrets. Out west, sometimes a man just rode into nothing forever.